to do something different, and she did. Edie as a co-director. Those of you who have seen Chow Manhattan or are aware of it, there's a very curious anomaly because there's no director credit. There was an original director, Chuck Wine, who John and I had some parting of the ways with early in the game. At the end of the day, we debated over and over and over how this was going to work, and finally we just decided that the film wrote itself. And there was a coincidence factor that's very strong in our lives, which is another subject, but we always were aware of the fact that this was collaboration. This is hardly the auteur theory. And the most powerful collaborator in this film was Edie. There's no question. Fate, coincidence, circumstances, and her will, more than anything, determined 5 years of our lives. We were caught into a vortex. It wasn't that she went out and made a decision and said, we're going to spend 5 years making this film. But we were constantly, me personally, I felt very Candide-like, because those of you who are familiar with the Voltaire story of the kind of naive, constantly chasing this elusive princess, Cunyagoan. And I was always just constantly chasing after, trying to keep up with Edie as she walked along the tightrope of her own life. And when it came to the making of the film, when we converged to California with her and lived with her for the majority of 1970 into 71, there was something that she said to John and me over and over and over: it's got to be real. If it's not real, there's no movie. And I never really understood what she meant. I mean, we talk about it over and over, but I never really got it. Was it a threat that if it's not real, she's not going to come to shoot? It was never like that. But if it's not real, it's not worth doing? I don't know. There was a sense of the reality of something she was trying to express with her whole being, that drew us along the way. And we weren't clever enough, we weren't talented enough we weren't forceful enough to sit down and write a script and then go do it. We kind of caught up with it as events happened. But there was no question that Edie is a co-director of Chow Manhattan, and certainly the co-director of everything she ever did.
That doesn't.
Something I'd like to say about that is our book touches on this really lightly, but in fact, the film that we're working on will touch on it much more, because we all certainly know of the films that Edie and Andy made together, though actually it's one of the frustrating things about Warhol films that they're so hard to see. And then, of course, Chow Manhattan. But Edie, in fact, it turns out, was working with other underground filmmakers, and one of the things that I hope our film will reflect is the fact that she felt like this was her medium, and everyone she was making movies with, on some level, made them the way Andy was making them. In other words, there was this idea that a film really is fully collaborative, and also a film in a way is making itself. And so people, again, look at Edie and think of her as an actress, but in fact she was a co-filmmaker, and not just in these contexts that we've just been discussing, but with some other really amazing filmmakers like Danny Williams, who you guys will all be introduced to in a couple of films that are coming out, who was another filmmaker at the factory. And also, she was involved with Penny Baker's scene, and was very moved by the films that he was making with Dylan, among others. And the idea behind those movies being that you really were just recording how someone was living their life in an honest way. So I find it interesting that she was chasing this in a lot of different areas and not just turning to Andy for it. Because as you can hear, there's a bit of frustration in their collaboration, and it would drive her nuts the first reel of the movie was out of focus. I mean, she would walk out of the theater, she would think he was making fun of her. So she didn't stop looking there. It was important enough to her to go find other people to work with. And the next you will see is about sort of the risk she was putting herself in by making these movies. In a way, I think, if you guys are cool with it, that just leads directly into the next clip about what Andy and Edie did with one of the first video cameras. There it is, make it real. Use the real people. No Walt Disney. John, What did it feel like to be in a movie that Warhol directed?
Well, it felt like you were taking your pants off. It was embarrassing. I wondered what you were doing. Why are you doing this? And yet at the same time, you knew, I mean, because you didn't know then, but to think about it now, I mean, imagine you're there and there's $100 million worth of art lying around on the floor. And these people fooling around with cameras, or Andy, and I'm there with him doing the same thing. And there's Edie, and we're all doing this. And so on the one hand, there's the rebellion because you know you're not supposed to somehow. And then on the other hand, you know that it's really, really important, and yet it's just going to disappear. That it's not really going to mean anything. So that was a peculiar feeling.
Look, $100 million of art on the floor, that's 40 years later.
Yeah, because at the time it would be Andy saying, John, could you go over there with Jerry and, put some paint on that rail and, could you help film the silk screen? Would you get the squeegees and so this was all going on.
It's funny, was when John shot Empire, it was his concept. John was 15 or 16. His mother was, John's from Hartford, and his mother was friendly with Sam Wagstaff, who was the curator of the Hartford Museum, which was one of the first museums.
The Wadsworth.
The Wadsworth, okay, where Henry Geltzeller promoted one of the first pop art shows. It was called
Well, Sam curated it. It was called Black, White, and Gray.
But didn't Henry?
Henry came up and
So anyway, John's mother, Mary Palmer, was one of the more sophisticated matrons in Hartford, and she was very close to me like that when she would throw the party after the show. And here was little 15-year-old John meeting Jasper Johns and Rosenquist and Andy, and sharing ideas with them. So when he finally became, shall we say, disenfranchised as a 18-year-old and dropped out of BU, he drove to New York, and we all had cars in those days, and with no money, somehow we had those sports cars, and so John drove and said to Andy, I had slept on Jonas Mekas' Filmmakers Cooperative rooftop, and said to Andy, I think we should do the Empire State Building, and they did, and it was, what was it, 8 hours or 24 hours, I can't remember.
something like that.
Something like that.
Eight.
Anyway, the point is that Andy was supposed to pay for the processing, and then at the last minute he decided that the build in the lab was too expensive. It was like $300 or something. So John called up Mary, his mother, and said, "Mom, can you get me out? This is my chance. This is my break." He was 18 years old, and so he calls up Andy from a phone booth and says, "All right, my mom is going to pay for the processing. We can get the film out of the lab." And he said, "Oh, that's great." John said, "There's one catch." "Well, what's that?" You've got to share credit with me. It was the only time Andy ever shared credit with anyone in the film. And Andy was a big pause, and Andy said, "Oh, now you're learning."
True story.
18. So Alice in Wonderland, has a lot of connotations here because the Jefferson Airplane song, was it the White Bunny? What was it called? The magic pill that we all love so much. You go down the rabbit hole. That was really another sense of what the experience of all of this of imagining yourself entering a fantasy world and just somehow making it real, making it happen, and never worrying about money. No one ever said a word about money. That came in the 90s. This is the 60s, and the Dylan documentary last year. What's it called?
No Direction.
Yeah, Bob Newirth actually astonished me in the second part of it when he said back then it was not about money. It was about, you have something to say, say it. I thought that was the most profound